Understood. Here's section 1, almost equals 1,150 words, crafted as a cinematic, character-driven narrative, introducing the main characters and the central conflict around Trump's racial history. David Carter had learned long ago that stories were not just about facts, they were about patterns. A single headline could be dismissed, a single scandal explained away. But when you laid the pieces together, a shape emerged, a truth too sharp to ignore. On a late winter night, hunched over his desk in a cramped New York apartment, David studied the first file of many, the one that began his journey into a man's shadow. The year was 1973, and the name printed across the top was Donald J. Trump. The document smelled of age, yellowed pages carrying the weight of history. The U.S. Department of Justice had accused Trump and his father's real estate company of refusing to rent apartments to black tenants. It was not hearsay, not rumor. It was the government itself saying the quiet part out loud. David ran his hand across the file, the ink of the charges glaring back at him like an accusation not just against one man but against the system that had protected him. He was not alone in this search. Samuel Wright, an aging civil rights lawyer, had agreed to meet him earlier that day. Samuel's presence lingered in David's mind. A tall, thin man with skin like weathered bronze and eyes sharp enough to slice through excuses. Samuel had lived the battles David was now tracing with pen and paper. He had fought in courtrooms when judges barely concealed their contempt. He had stood with families who wanted nothing more radical than a roof over their heads, only to be told they were the wrong color for the address. To Samuel, Trump was not new, not unique. He was part of a long, ugly tradition. Trump wasn't inventing racism, Samuel had said. His voice steady, deliberate, as though each word carried the weight of decades. He was perfecting how to profit from it. There's a difference. David remembered the way Samuel leaned back in his chair after saying that, the silence that followed. It wasn't anger that filled the old man's tone, but a kind of weary certainty. The certainty of someone who had seen this pattern too many times to be surprised. Into this unfolding story stepped Michael Torres, a younger activist who had built his voice from the streets rather than the courts. Michael had grown up in Queens, not far from the buildings the Trump organization managed. For him, this was not history. This was inheritance. His neighbors had been the ones told apartments were no longer available once their faces appeared in the lobby. His childhood friends had watched white families move in while their own applications mysteriously vanished. Michael spoke of it with a fire David could not ignore. They wrote the rules to keep people like us out, Michael said, his fists curling as if holding back more than words. And Trump played those rules like a damn piano. You can't tell me he didn't know. You don't do that by accident. The three men, bound by time and purpose, stood at different points of the same story. David, the seeker piecing together evidence. Samuel, the witness who had fought in real time. Michael, the inheritor, scarred by decisions made before he was born. Together they circled a single truth, that Trump's core was not an empty shell filled by politics, but a furnace stoked for decades. David's investigation grew heavier with each detail. The company had allegedly marked black applicants with secret codes, ensuring their files would never see approval. Undercover testers, black and white, applied for the same apartments, only for black applicants to be told nothing was available while white applicants were welcomed. It was a scheme so blatant, so cynical, that even in the language of bureaucracy it dripped with contempt. Yet the Trump family denied wrongdoing, settling the case without admitting guilt, and walking away with their empire intact. For Samuel, it was déjà vu. He recalled countless cases where settlement was victory only for the powerful, a way to escape accountability while maintaining the profits of discrimination. He told David how he had stood on courthouse steps, trying to explain to families why the law they believed in bent so easily around men with money. His words carried not just history but a bitterness that time had not erased. Michael's anger, however, was not about the past but about how it shaped the present. He reminded David of neighborhoods split by invisible lines, schools divided not by law but by the legacies of housing policy. This isn't just Trump's story, Michael said. This is America's story. But if we're going to talk about why his core is racist, we have to admit he learned early on that racism wasn't a liability. It was leverage. Those words echoed in David's head long after their meeting. Racism as leverage. He scribbled it in his notebook, underlined it twice. Because that was the thesis forming beneath the piles of documents. Trump's choices were not accidents of ignorance, nor slips of careless language. They were calculated steps, each one revealing what sat at his center. As the night deepened and snow tapped gently against his window, David leaned back and let the weight of his research settle over him. Here was the seed of a pattern. A young businessman, shielded by privilege, choosing profit over justice, exclusion over inclusion. Here was the first proof that when forced to pick between equality and advantage, Trump had chosen advantage without hesitation. And if this was the beginning, what would the rest of the story reveal? Samuel's words returned, spoken hours earlier in the fading light of a Harlem cafe. People want to believe racism is just a surface, a mask. But with some men, it's the marrow. You cut them open, and it's what keeps them upright. David closed the file and stared at the wall, imagining the road ahead. He could feel the story pulling him deeper, demanding more than detached observation. This was not just about Trump. This was about the lives bent beneath his shadow, the voices silenced by the machinery of his choices. And in the stillness of that moment, David realized his conflict was not only to uncover the evidence but to confront the uncomfortable truth it carried. That racism had not merely touched Trump's life, it had shaped him. He turned off the lamp, the city outside still humming with its restless energy. Tomorrow he would meet Michael again, and together they would trace the next chapter. For now, he let Samuel's warning settle in his chest, heavy as stone. The story had begun, but its ending was far from written. The deeper he went, the more dangerous the truth would become. And for the first time, David wondered if he was ready for what he would find. David had not slept much since opening that first file. The words, the codes, the reports of apartments mysteriously unavailable, had settled into him like smoke that refused to leave his lungs. By the time he sat across from Michael Torres again, his eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but his voice carried a sharper edge, the kind born from certainty. Michael noticed it instantly, leaning back in his chair with that restless energy of his, as if the stories David carried were sparks he was ready to turn into flame. "You found what you were looking for, didn't you?" Michael asked, not so much curious as confident. "I found enough," David replied. "Enough to know this wasn't an accident. It was a blueprint." Michael nodded slowly. He had expected nothing less. For him, Trump's pattern was not new knowledge. It was lived memory. He began speaking of the 80s, a decade he remembered not through textbooks but through faces. Uncles, cousins, friends who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't escape the suspicion of being out of place in their own neighborhoods. And then came the case that scarred New York, the one Michael still spoke of in clipped, angry bursts, the Central Park Five. He recounted the story as though it had happened yesterday. 5 boys, all black or Latino, accused of an unspeakable crime they did not commit. Their faces had been plastered across papers, their innocence stripped away by headlines before a trial could even begin. And there, in the middle of it all, Donald Trump had spent his fortune to demand their blood. "Full-page ads," Michael said, his jaw tight. He paid for them in 4 different papers. He didn't just want them punished. He wanted the death penalty back. His eyes burned, not with tears but with fury long kept alive. They were children, David. Children. And he called for their lives as if they were animals to be put down. David listened, pen scratching furiously across his notebook. He had read the ads, the block letters shouting for vengeance, but hearing it through Michael gave it flesh. It was no longer an artifact of history. It was a wound carried in real time. Did he ever apologize? David asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Michael's laugh was bitter, sharp. Apologize? Even after they were exonerated? He said he didn't care. He said they must have done something. That's the core of him. He can't see us as innocent. To him, we're guilty the moment we're born. That sentence cut deeper than any document David had collected. It was the heart of the conflict he was circling. Not merely Trump's actions but the way they revealed what pulsed inside him. If the first chapter had been about exclusion, this was about dehumanization. And for men like Michael, the scars had never faded. Later that evening, David met again with Samuel Wright, who had pulled from his shelves a heavy folder worn at the edges. Inside were clippings, transcripts, and his own handwritten notes from the era. Samuel had kept them not as trophies but as evidence, reminders of battles fought and truths denied. He spoke of the atmosphere of the time, New York aflame with fear, tabloids screaming for justice, and Trump pouring gasoline on the panic with his ads. "Fear is powerful," Samuel said, tapping the folder. "Men like Trump know how to weaponize it." He didn't need proof. He didn't want it. The accusation itself was enough, because it played into every stereotype about young Black and Latino men. He knew exactly what he was doing. David leaned forward. "So you think it wasn't just anger, it was strategy?" Samuel nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Always strategy. You don't pay for ads like that unless you know the currency they buy." And what it bought him was attention, credibility among those who already believed the worst about our people. He wasn't simply feeding prejudice. He was marketing it. The weight of that revelation settled over David like a stone. Trump's choices were not random sparks of bigotry. They were deliberate investments, calculated moves that paid dividends in fame and influence. This was not a man stumbling into racist rhetoric. This was a man building himself upon it. As the night wore on, Samuel brought up another chapter, birtherism. The word itself carried the sour taste of conspiracy, yet it had reshaped political discourse in ways few could have predicted. Trump had not merely questioned President Barack Obama's birthplace. He had demanded proof again and again, fanning the flames of suspicion even when the truth was irrefutable. "Understand this," Samuel said, his voice quieter now, as though confiding something sacred. "To question a Black man's legitimacy is an old tactic. It says, 'You may rise, but you will never belong.' And for millions of people who hated the idea of a Black president, Trump gave them language. He gave them permission." David felt a shiver travel down his spine. He remembered watching those press conferences years earlier, the smug certainty in Trump's tone as he insisted on birth certificates and records, as though a man's very existence could be reduced to paperwork. Had seemed absurd then, almost comical. But through Samuel's eyes and Michael's fury, the comedy was gone. What remained was the naked cruelty of a campaign that stripped dignity from the highest office in the land. By the time the clock crept past midnight, David's notes had become a map of interconnected points. Housing discrimination, Central Park 5, birtherism. Each thread tied together, weaving the shape of a man who thrived on division. He realized he was not merely tracing history. He was tracing the anatomy of a worldview. Michael's words came back to him, racism as leverage. Samuel's echoed alongside them, fear as currency. And David understood now that Trump's racism was not a matter of clumsy speech or personal prejudice alone. It was the bedrock of his public persona, the engine that powered his rise from real estate mogul to television star to political force. As dawn began to edge its way through the city skyline, David closed his notebook with a slow, deliberate motion. His mind was exhausted, yet alive with clarity. The deeper he looked, the more he saw the same outline repeating, like the watermark of a forged document. Trump's story was not a string of isolated incidents. It was a design. He thought of the boys in the park, the families denied homes, the president forced to defend his own birthright. Each episode revealed another layer of the same core. And though David wanted to believe that people could change, the evidence told him otherwise. Trump had built a life, a brand, even a movement on the back of these choices. To deny it was to close one's eyes to the obvious. When he finally rose from his desk, stretching stiff limbs, he felt the tug of the road ahead. This was only the middle of the story, yet already the truth was too loud to ignore. He would have to follow it further, into the presidency itself, where words became laws and prejudice became policy. He dreaded what he might uncover, but he knew there was no turning back. Because now, the question was not whether Trump's core was racist. The question was how far that core had reached and how much damage it had done. David Carter had expected hostility in politics, but when he began digging into Donald Trump's presidency, he was struck by how quickly rhetoric had turned into tangible harm. The man whose early career had thrived on exclusion and whose rise to fame was built on public humiliation now stood at the helm of a nation, wielding the full force of government. For David, this was where his investigation sharpened into a blade. It was no longer about documents or ads. It was about lives changed, families torn, and a country divided. Michael Torres felt the shift most acutely. As a Latino activist, he had grown used to hearing slurs whispered on street corners, but 2016 was different. When Trump descended that golden escalator and declared that Mexican immigrants were criminals and rapists, Michael felt an old wound ripped open before millions. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a strategy, the same kind Samuel Wright had warned about. Racism as leverage, fear as currency. Trump had turned a campaign launch into a call to arms for prejudice, and the crowd had cheered. "You don't forget the sound of people clapping when your people are being condemned," Michael told David one evening as they walked through Jackson Heights. The neighborhood buzzed with languages from every corner of the world, but under that vibrancy lay unease. "My father came here with nothing, worked until his back nearly broke. And then some billionaire says men like him are the enemy. That sticks. That burns." David scribbled in his notebook, watching Michael's hands gesture with restless energy. He realized this wasn't just about words, but about the permission those words granted. Hate that had once lurked at the edges now strutted openly. A candidate who spoke of walls and bans gave ordinary people license to point fingers at their neighbors. Samuel Wright, still carrying his quiet gravitas, met David in his law office where shelves sagged with decades of case files. He laid out Trump's Muslim ban, the executive order signed days after taking office, which blocked travelers from several Muslim-majority countries. Samuel read the language with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting each clause until its intention was laid bare. "This wasn't security," Samuel said firmly, tapping the page. "This was exclusion dressed up in policy. They didn't need to say the word Muslim to make the message clear. It was the same playbook I've seen all my life. Find a group, mark them as dangerous, then convince the public you're protecting them by keeping that group out." David thought of airports filled with stranded families, of protests erupting across terminals where ordinary Americans held signs that read "No ban, no wall." He remembered the images of crying children, separated from their parents at the border, huddled under foil blankets. These were not abstractions. They were the human toll of an ideology translated into governance. Michael recounted his own visits to detention centers along the border. His voice faltered only once, when he described a boy no older than 7 who clutched a scrap of paper with his mother's phone number, written in shaky handwriting. "He asked me if I thought they'd let him call her," Michael said, swallowing hard. "I didn't know what to tell him. How do you explain to a child that a president decided he doesn't belong with his family?" David let the silence stretch, the weight of the story hanging between them. Each detail pressed harder against his thesis. Trump's core was not merely racist in sentiment, but in execution. As they pieced together the years of Trump's presidency, Charlottesville became a dark pivot point. In August 2017, white supremacists marched with torches, chanting, "You will not replace us." A counter-protester was killed, and the nation watched in horror. Trump's response, saying there were very fine people on both sides, landed like a thunderclap. Samuel's eyes blazed as he spoke of it. There are moments in history where leaders must draw a line, unequivocal and clear. That was one. And instead of condemning hate, he excused it. "That's not weakness. That's alignment. You don't stumble into that kind of equivocation. You choose it, Michael added. When he said that, every white supremacist in America heard what they wanted. They heard approval. And every Black and Latino family heard what they feared, that their president saw their killers as equals. For David, Charlottesville crystallized the conflict. This was no longer a question of interpretation or partisan spin. It was the President of the United States refusing to condemn racism because racism was not an accident in his story. It was the marrow. He felt the conflict within himself deepen as he reviewed Trump's words, his policies, his patterns. As a journalist, David longed for detachment, the clean lines of evidence and conclusion. Neutrality began to feel like complicity. The 2020 protests after George Floyd's murder brought the story to its crescendo. David watched as Trump declared, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," a phrase steeped in segregationist history. Samuel, nearly trembling with restrained fury, explained that he had heard those very words from police chiefs in the South during the 1960s. "They used it as a threat," Samuel said. "And now a president repeats it. That's not ignorance. That's continuity." The protests he joined, where men and women filled the streets with chants of justice, only to be met with tear gas and troops. "He called us thugs," Michael said. "We were citizens demanding dignity. And he called us thugs." For David, the puzzle pieces aligned with terrifying clarity. Housing discrimination, the Central Park Five, birtherism, the Muslim ban, immigrant cages, Charlottesville, the protests. It was not a scatter of isolated events. It was a straight line, a continuum. Trump's racism was not peripheral. It was the engine of his politics, the force that drove his rise and shaped his governance. Late one night, David returned to Samuel's office, seeking not just facts but guidance. "How do we tell this story?" he asked, the exhaustion in his voice undeniable. "How do we make people see what's right in front of them?" Samuel studied him for a long moment before answering. "Truth doesn't always change people," he said finally. "But clarity matters. Document it, show it, and let history judge. That's our duty." Michael, when David relayed this conversation, was less restrained. History. People are living this now. Kids are still in cages. Families are still being torn apart. If we don't call it what it is, we're just letting it happen again. The tension between Samuel's weary patience and Michael's urgent fire pressed on David. It mirrored the conflict at the heart of his investigation, the slow march of justice against the immediate harm of prejudice. But both men agreed on the core truth, that Trump's racism was not incidental. It was deliberate, consistent, and devastating. The final question was more chilling. What did this core mean for the country that had embraced him? How had America itself been reshaped by a man who turned division into power? David capped his pen, staring at the stack of pages before him. Each section of the story had built upon the last, growing darker, more undeniable. Now the task was not just to recount Trump's racism, but to confront what it revealed about the nation that had lifted him to its highest office. He felt the weight of the question pressing down like a storm on the horizon. The night was heavy with silence when David Carter gathered his notes for the final time. The city beyond his window pulsed with distant traffic and restless sirens, but inside his apartment, only the scratch of his pen could be heard. He had reached the end of his investigation, and yet he felt no sense of closure, only the growing weight of the truth he had uncovered. The pages before him told a story not of isolated incidents but of a life shaped, sustained, and empowered by racism. It was a core truth he could no longer avoid. He called Michael Torres first. The young activist's voice came through the line raw and impatient, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. David told him he wanted to meet, to bring everything together, to lay it bare in one place. Michael agreed instantly, his tone sharp with conviction. "It's time," he said. "People need to hear it without the filters, without the excuses." Samuel Wright was slower to answer when David reached him. The old lawyer's pauses carried decades of battles fought and scars earned. Yet even in his measured cadence, there was urgency. If you're ready to speak it plainly, Samuel told him, then I'll stand beside you. But you must know, truth cuts both ways. Once spoken, it cannot be taken back. They met in Samuel's office, a room that smelled faintly of leather and dust, where shelves groaned with files that mapped the injustices of half a century. The air was thick with gravity as the three men sat together, their faces lit by the amber glow of a single desk lamp. Each of them represented a different thread of the same story. David the investigator, Michael the witness of lived harm, Samuel the keeper of legal memory. Now those threads had to be woven into one conclusion. David began, his voice low but steady. He walked them through the evidence once more. The housing discrimination cases that revealed how Trump's empire had been built on exclusion, the Central Park 5 ads that showed his willingness to demand death for children of color, the birther conspiracy that cast doubt on the legitimacy of America's first black president, the policies that banned Muslims, caged immigrant children, and treated suffering as spectacle, Charlottesville, where he equated torch-bearing supremacists with their victims. The tweets that echoed segregationist threats during the protests for George Floyd. Each episode alone was damning, but together they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Michael leaned forward, his elbows on the table, fists clenched. "It's not just a pattern," he said, fire in his voice. "It's a choice." Every time he had a chance to stand with justice, he sided with prejudice. Every single time. That doesn't happen by mistake. It happens because that's who he is. Samuel nodded slowly, the deep lines on his face illuminated by the lamplight. "And in law," he added, "we don't judge men solely by their intentions. We judge them by their actions, by the consequences they bring." Trump's actions, time and again, carried the same consequence. They dehumanized, excluded, and endangered communities of color. The defense of ignorance collapses under the weight of repetition. David felt his chest tighten. He knew they were not simply building an argument, they were delivering a verdict. He had tried to resist this conclusion, to keep his reporting detached, but the evidence had dragged him here, demanding honesty. His pen shook slightly as he wrote the words in his notebook. Trump's racism is not incidental. It is essential. The three men sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the city's hum pressed faintly against the windows, but within those walls, time felt suspended. Finally, Michael broke the quiet. "You know what hurts most," he said, his voice softer now. "It's not just him. It's the millions who saw all of this and still cheered. He didn't invent hate, but he made it acceptable. He made it something to rally behind." David's gaze dropped to the table. That was the deeper conflict gnawing at him. The man's core was racist, yes, but what did it say about a nation that embraced it, that elevated it, that excused it? Exposing Trump was one thing. Confronting America's complicity was another. Samuel's voice, heavy with age, carried the weight of the answer. History has shown us this before. One man amplifies the hatred already there, gives it shape, gives it a flag. But history also shows that truth, once spoken clearly, can shift the ground beneath us. It may not erase the hate, but it denies it the comfort of silence. David lifted his head, meeting Samuel's eyes, then Michael's. The conflict that had pulled him through sleepless nights was no longer abstract. It was alive in this room, in the choice they faced. To tell the story bluntly was to risk backlash, dismissal, even danger. But to soften it would be to betray the evidence and the people harmed by it. He straightened in his chair, his decision clear. "Then we tell it," he said firmly. "We show that this isn't a matter of debate." From the start of his career to the end of his presidency, Trump's racism wasn't a flaw, it was the foundation. And if people still choose to deny it, let them. But history will know. Michael's eyes gleamed, fierce and unyielding. "Then let's say it the way it needs to be said. Loud. Uncompromising. Because every kid who grows up hearing they don't belong needs to know the truth was on their side." Samuel leaned back, exhaling deeply. "Then this is our closing argument," he said, his voice echoing with the cadence of a courtroom. The evidence has been presented, the testimonies heard, the pattern established. And the verdict is clear. Trump's core is racist, not by slip or accident but by design. The jury of history may deliberate, but the facts are unshakable. The room seemed to grow heavier, the finality of the moment pressing down on them. David felt both dread and relief. The story was complete, its climax reached, its truth undeniable. He knew the words would cut, would provoke, would divide. But he also knew they would endure, etched into the record he had fought to assemble. As the men rose to leave, David paused at the doorway, looking back at Samuel's office one last time. The shelves of files, the worn desk, the lamp casting long shadows. It all felt like a courtroom where the final judgment had been spoken. He carried the image with him, knowing it would burn into his memory. On the street outside, Michael shoved his hands into his pockets, shoulders squared against the cold night air. "You think people will listen?" he asked quietly. David glanced at him, then at Samuel, who walked beside them with the slow, steady stride of a man who had carried burdens longer than either of them. "Some will," David answered. "Some won't. But the truth doesn't depend on who accepts it. It just needs to be told." They walked on in silence, the city lights flickering around them, each man lost in his thoughts. The investigation was over, but the battle it illuminated stretched on. Yet in their hearts, a strange certainty pulsed. They had spoken the truth plainly, without evasion, without fear. And though the world might resist it, the truth would remain, unyielding as story.